everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Heather, and today I am here to talk to you about my journey with Victorian literature. I honestly felt like I hadn't read as many pieces of Victorian literature as I have as I've started to go through my shelves and my Goodreads, but at the same time there is so much more that I want to read. Firstly, let's start in my childhood. I only had a couple of Victorian children's books. I had these lovely editions of Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, which used to belong to my mother, which I really loved because A, I kind of felt superior to all of my peers who only knew about the Disney film, and B, that they still have the Tenniel illustrations. My mother and I would always have a read-aloud book as well, in addition to whatever both of us were reading independently. So, and in our read-alouds together, we read both The Secret Garden and A Little Princess, and I much preferred The Secret Garden. A Little Princess just made me so incredibly sad. But I loved The Secret Garden. I hope I still have Secret Garden. Were they paper dolls? It was something that I could play with as well that had Colin and Dickon and Mary. So this holds a special place. I've never actually read Little Lord Fauntleroy. I feel like we started it and both my mother and I decided, you know what? Just not for us. We are just not feeling this. I also used to have a book of Robert Louis Stevenson's poetry for children, but we must have gotten rid of it at some point because I cannot find it on my shelves anymore. But I distinctly remember having it once upon a time. Then we get to high school, and surprisingly, I could only pull 4 Victorian novels from everything that I read in high school, which was quite a lot. If you want to hear about my full curricular reading experiences, I had a video about that about 2 years ago, which I will try to locate and link down below. If not, it is somewhere on my channel. The 2 that I distinctly remember reading in class were first A Tale of Two Cities. I read this in my first year of high school, and I remember loving it. And A, I remember loving it even though I have a feeling most of my classmates didn't. And B, I remember my first run-in with the man who would be my geometry teacher next year and remains to this day one of my favorite teachers. I had to stay after school to make something up for math class, and he came in to ask my teacher a question about something, and as he walked out he pointed at A Tale of Two Cities that I was reading as I was waiting and went, "Terrible book, terrible book." He is the most sarcastic man I have ever met, by the way, and I soon found that out. But I particularly loved it nonetheless, regardless of what my classmates thought or what Mr. K thought. And then the next one that I remember reading for school was Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, and this I read in my last year of high school in AP Literature. And this one my classmates and I enjoyed a lot more. Let's face it, anyone who takes AP tends to love literature more than your standard high school student. And this one was particularly fun because the first day of discussion, our teacher was absent. We loved Mrs. Clark, we wanted her to be there, but she couldn't be for whatever reason. I don't think there was a lesson plan. I think she told our substitute, just let them talk. And we did. We talked about this book for the entire 50 minutes. And I remember having the best time and talking about the Yorkshire accent and how do you deal with that and what are these relationships like, and someone bringing up that Mrs. Clark had told him that it was about animals and, you know, tame animals versus wild animals, and once you tame an animal it can't go back to the wild, which stays with me to this day. And it was one of the single best English classes I remember having. And then I had two more run-ins with Victorian literature on my own. The first was reading Jane Eyre. I remember getting a tiny paperback copy of this out from the school library during midterms. I don't remember whether it was my first or second year of high school, and reading it and discovering, oh, it's not nearly as complicated a writing style as I thought it was going to be, which was really lovely. And really enjoying it, but never really investigating whether there was anything else by Charlotte Bronte. I think I thought that this was the only thing that she had written, because it's the only one that people seemingly talk about. And the last thing that I ran into independently was the importance of being earnest. And this was in my third year of high school, when the drama club put on The Importance of Being Earnest as the fall play. And my Spanish teacher was also the director of drama club, and I knew a lot of people who were in it. So of course I went and I supported them and I saw it, and I thought it was the funniest thing I had ever seen. And I'm kind of pleased that that was my first introduction to Oscar Wilde. Then we get to my university years, and here again I realized exactly how few classes I took that focused on Victorian literature. Most of my English classes tended to focus on earlier writing. I took a lot of 18th century courses, whether that be poetry or the development of the novel, or I took a lot of early modern drama classes, so reading a lot of Shakespeare and Webster and all of those early playwrights. During my freshman year, however, I did take Romanticism to Modernism. So we read a wide variety of works in there, which included rereading Wuthering Heights, then going into Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, which I did not really enjoy, although I love the fact that there are two separate endings, which I never knew. We then read some poetry by Gerard Manley Hopkins, which, again, not my favorite. It was nice, just not to my taste. And then we ended the Victorian section by reading Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, which was surprisingly more enjoyable than I thought it was going to be. And then the only other class that I took specifically on Victorian literature was my senior seminar in my final year of university, where we focused specifically on Thomas Hardy. So we read Far from the Madding Crowd, which my mother is borrowing at the moment, The Return of the Native, The Mayor of Casterbridge, which I am pleased to be rereading at the moment, and Tess of the D'Urbervilles, along with a break in the middle for some of his short stories. This collection is called The Distracted Preacher and Other Tales, and some of his poetry, which I have in a massive volume here behind me, which I do not want to dig out right now. But if you've seen my TBR for this month, you will have seen it there. On my own, I really only discovered a couple other Victorian novels. The first of which was Bleak House, which I've spoken about before, I think, in terms of I had seen the miniseries and really loved it. And I was in Spain, and English books were really hard to come by. So my mother sent me a cheap paperback copy of this because it is huge, and she hoped that that would keep me busy for a long time. And indeed it did, and I loved every second of it. I then also discovered Gaskell miniseries, which made her send me North and South and Cranford. I remember reading Cranford first. This was the first thing I pulled out of her suitcase when they came to visit me. And I remember reading North and South on the plane home from Sevilla, and how it kept me hooked even though I had been awake since 3 a.m. to get on that plane. So really the bulk of my Victorian reading has been later in my life, and I would say mainly because of YouTube and BookTube. So first of all, thank you all so much for pushing me to read all of these books, because they really are wonderful, but I don't know if I would have read them otherwise. So when I first started student teaching, I remember reading Little Dorrit from around November into Christmas, and absolutely adoring it. Again, I had seen the miniseries earlier, but reading it even after that is so completely magical because they captured these characters so perfectly from all the detail that Dickens gives you. I also saw some more plays thanks to National Theatre, such as Salome by Oscar Wilde. And Salome is also Oscar Wilde's retelling of the story of John the Baptist's death, focusing on Salome, the dancing girl who asked for his head. And it really centers around her as a feminist figure, as a political pawn, as every kind of pawn that you can think of, which completely reframes that story. And Yael Farber's production of it was extra fascinating to watch. I also read Carmilla by J. Sheridan Le Fanu, thanks to the web series Carmilla. When I first started teaching, I feel like that was when all of the literary web series adaptations started to come out, like Anne with an E, like Nothing Much to Do, inspired by the Lizzie Bennet diaries. And I remember watching a lot of them as I was sitting in my room at the end of the day trying to get some work done. And Carmilla was absolutely fascinating and yet absolutely creepy, but I loved it nonetheless. So I tracked down the book from my library as well once I found out that it was a Victorian vampire novel. And I have to say, I think I liked the web series that little bit better, but I do want to read other J. Sheridan Le Fanu books in the future. Pre-BookTube, I also read Under the Greenwood Tree by Thomas Hardy, as I tried to read more of his shorter works from the beginning of his writing career. I remember this one being pretty cute. I remember the opening scene with the church choir being absolutely hilarious and wanting to lend it to my own choir director. But overall, I found it just okay. I'm glad Professor Flynn had us focus on the 4 novels that I spoke to you about earlier. I also read Wives and Daughters, which I didn't love the first time around. Now that I've loved the adaptation, maybe I'll go back to it. I was trying to read it during state testing one year, which is always an incredibly stressful period. So that might have had something to do with why I didn't like it very much. But I have read it at least once at least. And everything else that I have here in this pile, I think is due to BookTube. First of all, thanks to the wonderful Marissa's Bronte project, I have now read all of the works by all of the Brontes. Some I don't have here with me, like I don't have The Professor or Villette anymore, because I just didn't enjoy them. But I have read them. I also read Shirley by Charlotte Bronte. In fact, I read that just before that project started for my first Victober. This was the group read. And I also now read Anne Bronte's works. Read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall and Agnes Grey, both of which I enjoyed very much. Thanks to BookTube, I also read Mary Barton and was able to discuss it with folks like Marissa and Megan the Story Girl, and that was a lot of fun, so I really want to read more of Gaskell's work. Oh, I did, because Gothic Tales was the group read last year, so I read some of her short stories as well. And then last year's Victober got me to read a bunch of new and exciting books. I remember reading Mugby Junction, which was Charles Dickens's collaboration with 4 other authors down here at the bottom to write a collection of stories centering around the train junction of Mugby Junction, which I think was just ingenious. Like with all short story collections, some of them are better than others, but I really loved finding this and reading it. I also read Thomas Hardy's other major novel, which was Jude the Obscure, and loved it, even though it deeply, deeply hurt my soul. That's the thing with Hardy, he does that, but I find that such a moving experience, and that's the part that I really enjoy, is that it has the power to move me. I also read my first real sensation novel, which was Lady Audley's Secret, and I really enjoyed it, so I'm looking forward to reading more sensation novels. Like I have East Lynne on Kindle, just like I have Uncle Silas by J. Sheridan Le Fanu. So I'm hoping to get to those as well, because those are perfect for October. And Victober also made me start reading Trollope, and I'm so glad because I love Anthony Trollope's writing. So far I've been working my way through the Barsetshire series. So we have The Warden, Barchester Towers, and I just finished Dr. Thorne last month. So I'm really hoping to continue with this series. I also now have a ton of his standalones that I would like to read, like The Way We Live Now and The American Senator. So I am thrilled to keep working through those as well. I also read The Master of Ballantrae last year by Robert Louis Stevenson, which was not as good as I hoped that it would be, but I'm glad that I've read some of his lesser known novels as well. So even though these were a lot more books than I thought that I had read, this still just feels like the tip of the iceberg, because every Victober I watch other people's TBRs and think, oh my gosh, that's brilliant. Why haven't I read that yet? Yes, of course I want to read that one. I've never heard of that one, but that sounds amazing. So this is not only my catalog of books I've read so far, but it's also a thank you to this whole community for giving me so much more to look forward to. Let me know down below what your first Victorian novel was. What are some ones that you feel like you still need to read that seem to be on everybody's lists? Or if you have any other recommendations for me as I continue this journey going forward. Until next time, be safe, be well, and happy reading. Bye everyone.